90%. Just think about that number for a second. By 1600, the Native American population, well, it had dropped by an estimated 90% after Europeans arrived. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Hi there. Yes, today we're diving right into that monumental encounter. We're talking about the 15th and 16th centuries when Europeans first made significant contact with the Americas.
And we've got some fascinating sources to look at today, detailing those initial meetings, the cultural clashes that were almost inevitable, and really what was driving the main players on all sides.
Our mission, really, is to give you, our listeners, a clear, concise understanding of this absolutely pivotal time. We want to go beyond the sort of simple stories you might have heard.
Yeah, to get into the complexities, the consequences for everyone involved, and hopefully you'll have a few aha moments as we uncover some surprising facts and contrasting viewpoints. Okay, let's jump in. Where did the people already living in the Americas actually come from?
Well, the most widely accepted theory points to the Bering Strait land bridge, Beringia, they call it. It connected Asia and North America way back when.
And the time frame for that migration?
The thinking is it started over 40,000 years ago. These first peoples, they gradually spread south all the way down the continents. They reached the tip of South America by around, 8,000 BC.
40,000 years. That's just...
Yeah.
It's immense. And our picture of this is still kind of developing, right?
It is, yeah. There's archaeological evidence, like sites up in the Yukon, Old Crow, suggesting people might have been there even earlier, maybe 50,000 years ago. And worked in Brazil, too, looking at a site possibly 48,000 years old.
Wow.
And interestingly, some research back in the 90s even floated the idea of earlier migrations from South Asia or possibly Europe. It just shows how we're constantly refining this story.
And there's that complexity with Siberia, too.
Right. The evidence we have now suggests eastern Siberia wasn't really populated in a big way until maybe 12,000 years ago. So that does raise some, interesting questions about the classic Bering Strait migration timeline.
Okay, so over these vast stretches of time, these populations spread out, diversified, developing countless distinct cultures, languages.
Exactly. And by the time Europeans show up, some really remarkable societies had emerged. We see permanent farming villages developing between about 4,000 and 1,500 BC.
Farming. What were the key crops?
Oh, maize corn was huge. But also amaranth, manioc, chili peppers, pumpkins, sweet potatoes, beans. These form the foundation for more complex, settled societies.
Like the big names we often hear about, the Incas down in Peru, the Aztecs in Mexico, the Mayans. These were really advanced civilizations, weren't they?
Absolutely. These were sedentary societies, advanced farming, based heavily on corn. They built incredible stone cities. Rivals to many in Europe at that time.
And complex social structures.
Definitely. They had division of labor, sure. Both men and women farmed. They developed ways to store food surpluses. And they made huge strides in math, astronomy. Really sophisticated stuff.
Okay, so that's the Incas, Aztecs, Mayans. But if we shift focus north to North America around Columbus's time, the picture is a bit different. Most tribes are described as semi-sedentary. What does that mean exactly?
It generally means they lived in smaller communities, maybe more spread out, sometimes moving seasonally. They definitely practiced agriculture, often developed and managed mainly by women, but maybe not on the same massive scale as the empires further south.
And the division of labor was different, too.
Typically, yes. The general pattern was men focused on hunting, women on gathering and farming. Though, interestingly, tobacco cultivation was often handled by men.
And this difference, this whole societal organization, it led to some major misunderstandings when Europeans arrived, didn't it? Especially around work and land.
Oh, profoundly. Europeans looked at it through their own lens. They saw men hunting, women farming, and thought the men weren't working properly by European farming standards. They wanted to, quote, reduce Indian men to civility through farming.
But the Native American men had a different view.
Very different. Many saw farming as primarily women's work, and they valued their time for hunting, politics, ritual, even leisure, which, ironically, wasn't totally unlike the European aristocracy's view of manual labor. It was a real point of friction.
And the whole idea of owning land. That was another huge disconnect.
A critical one. Many North American societies were matrilineal, tracing lineage through the mother, and often matrilocal, meaning a husband moved in with the wife's family.
Completely alien to European systems.
Totally. And the European concept of individual land ownership, buying and selling plots, that just wasn't really there in the same way. It was more about clans or families having use rights to certain areas, often allocated by chiefs.
So not about accumulating private property,
Generally, no. There wasn't the same drive to accumulate vast personal possessions, especially things you couldn't easily move if needed. Europeans saw this lack of private property and, well, judged it as less civilized, less economically developed. It set the stage for centuries of conflict over who owned the land.
And status wasn't tied to wealth accumulation either. I remember reading something about generosity being highly valued.
Yes, that's fascinating. Generosity, sharing, contributing to the community's well-being, these were often the paths to high status. There were huge trade networks, especially in the Ohio and Mississippi valleys.
But trade wasn't just like a business deal.
No, it was more like an ongoing relationship. Gift-giving was central. Stopping trade wasn't just ending a contract. It was often seen as a hostile act, a signal of potential conflict. Giving things away often brought more respect than hoarding them.
So even though they're called semi-sedentary, we're talking about complex societies in North America too. Can you give us some examples?
Definitely. Look at the Pueblo peoples in the Southwest, the Rio Grande Valley. Highly skilled farmers, especially with corn. They developed amazing irrigation systems for that dry climate.
And their dwellings.
Incredible multi-storied buildings, sometimes terraced. Some are among the oldest continuously lived-in places in North America.
What about the mound builders?
The Mississippian culture. Their main center, Cahokia, near modern St. Louis, was enormous, possibly as big as some European cities at the time. They built these huge earthen mounds.
Like the big one at Cahokia.
Exactly. The central mound is 100 feet high, the largest earthwork in the world. They had iron tools, they wove fabrics, complex burial rituals, and their trade network stretched for hundreds, maybe thousands of miles.
It really blows up the idea of a simple, undeveloped North America. What about closer to the Atlantic coast?
Those tribes also had sophisticated agriculture, corn, beans, squash, the Three Sisters. The Creeks in the southeast had a democratic government structure. The Choctaw, the Cherokee, large, well-organized group.
And the Iroquois, they're famous.
The Iroquois Confederacy, yes. Formed probably in the late 16th century, traditionally by Hiawatha, a powerful military and political alliance of initially 5 nations Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, Senecas.
And their society centered around the Longhouse.
Right. These communal dwellings could be massive, sometimes up to 200 feet long, housing multiple related families. So yes, a really rich, diverse landscape of cultures existed before Europeans arrived in large numbers.
Okay, so we have these established, diverse societies. Then Europeans arrive. And the differences weren't just social or economic, they went right down to fundamental worldviews, religion, warfare. These were major points of, well, collision.
Absolutely. That clash of worldviews is central to understanding the conflicts that followed. Take religion. The Christian Bible, as Europeans interpreted it, gave humans dominion over nature.
Which contrasts sharply with many Native American views.
Very much so. Many indigenous beliefs stressed an interconnectedness, a reciprocal relationship with the natural world. Plus, the Bible didn't mention the peoples of the Americas, which caused, theological confusion for Europeans. Where did these people fit?
And European views of Native American religions, especially in Mesoamerica, were not charitable.
No. When they saw the temples, the skull racks, the serpent imagery of the Aztecs, for example, many Europeans jumped to the conclusion they were worshiping Satan.
Which is ironic, considering what was happening in Europe at the same time.
Exactly. Europe was deep in its own religious turmoil. Witch hunts killed maybe 100,000 people between 1500 and 1700. The Spanish Inquisition executed thousands more. It's not hard to imagine Native Americans looking at those practices and seeing them as human sacrifice, too.
A really powerful point. And the differences extended to everyday things, like ideas about nature, food, even death.
Right. The whole European idea of commodifying nature, owning plants, animals, land for profit, was often baffling to Native Americans. And the Christian Eucharist, the ritual consumption of bread and wine as Christ's body and blood, that was deeply confusing to them.
And ideas about the afterlife.
Also very different. The Christian concept of a separate heaven wasn't really shared. Many Native Americans preferred burial with their ancestors, staying connected to their lineage and land. The idea of a heaven where few Indians would likely be wasn't very appealing, according to reports.
Okay, let's shift to warfare. Again, fundamentally different approaches.
Yes. Europeans tended to focus on decisive, large-scale battles to gain territory or destroy an enemy army. Native Americans often found this perplexing, a huge waste of life.
Their tactics were different.
Often, yes. more focused on guerrilla warfare raids, ambushes, minimizing their own casualties, capturing enemies to replenish their own numbers or for ritual purposes, attrition rather than annihilation in one big battle.
And Europeans struggled with this.
They did. They found it hard to pin down Native American warriors for the kind of battles they were used to. There were also different views on things like torture, though it existed in various forms in both cultures. Interestingly, Jesuit missionaries were sometimes noted, even admired by some tribes, for their stoicism under duress.
And when Europeans couldn't fight on their preferred terms, things often got brutal.
Tragically, yes. Frustrated by guerrilla tactics, Europeans sometimes resorted to attacking villages, targeting non-combatants, women, and children to break resistance. The Pequot War in the 1630s is a grim example.
Did Native Americans adopt similar tactics later?
Sadly, in some cases, yes. By King Philip's War in the 1670s, some native groups were attacking colonial settlements and killing non-combatants. We also need to acknowledge practices like capturing children from enemies, which existed among some tribes, and the ritual sacrifice or torture of captives, particularly in Mesoamerica and among groups like the Iroquois.
And then you add European weapons into this mix.
That just escalated everything dramatically.
Right.
Firearms intensified intertribal warfare. The Ohio Valley, for example, saw massive depopulation in the late 17th century, partly because the Iroquois, armed by trade, waged war on other groups. Disease was the biggest killer by far, but intensified warfare definitely contributed significantly to the demographic collapse.
Okay, so we had the context. Diverse American societies, clashing worldviews. Now let's look squarely at the Europeans. What drove them across the Atlantic? We know about Columbus, but what were the broader forces?
Well, there are those earlier voyages, maybe Afro-Phoenicians, West Africans, certainly the Vikings, Leif Erikson around 1000 AD, but they didn't establish lasting settlements. The big wave from the 15th century onwards had several key drivers.
Like the rise of bigger nations in Europe.
Exactly. You have these emerging nation states, Portugal, Spain, later France and England, competing fiercely for power and influence. New military technology gave them an edge, too, especially after 1500 or so.
Economics must have been huge.
Oh, absolutely. The desire for new markets, new trade routes, especially a sea route to Asia to bypass overland traders, was critical. Spices, silk, gold, silver. This ties into mercantilism, the idea that national wealth depended on accumulating precious metals and controlling trade.
And religion.
A major factor. Competition between Catholic and Protestant states fueled rivalry. Spreading Christianity was often a stated and sometimes genuine motivation.
Plus technology and a change in mindset.
Right. Better maps, better ships like the caravel, the compass, the astrolabe for navigation, cannons on ships. These made long voyages possible and, frankly, more effective militarily. And then you have the Renaissance spirit, that sense of rebirth, optimism, curiosity about the world. Exploration fit right into that.
Portugal really kicked things off, didn't they? Under Prince Henry the Navigator.
They did. Prince Henry was a key promoter in the 15th century. First, they explored down the African coast, looking for trade routes south of the Sahara. Later, the big goal was the sea route to Asia.
Which they eventually found.
Yes. Bartolomé Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488. Then Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498, opening up that incredibly lucrative route and building Portugal's Eastern Empire.
And they stumbled upon Brazil, too.
Right. Pedro Cabral landed there in 1500. And Amerigo Vespucci, sailing for Portugal, explored the coast. His detailed accounts led a mapmaker to name the continents America. Portugal built this huge trading network: Africa, India, East Indies, China, and Brazil.
But Spain's arrival with Columbus really opened the door to the Americas as we think of it. What was driving Columbus specifically?
Spain was desperate to catch up with Portugal. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand backed Columbus. He was, well, complex, deeply religious. He actually believed the world might end in 1648 and saw it as his mission to spread Christianity everywhere before then, maybe achieve sainthood.
But also looking for wealth.
Definitely. Gold, spices, a westward route to the Indies. On October 12, 1492, he lands in the Bahamas, convinced he's near Asia. He encounters the Arawak people on Hispaniola.
And the consequences for the Arawaks were devastating.
Utterly. Columbus and his men essentially wiped them out through violence, enslavement, and disease. And Columbus, he went to his grave in 1506, still insisting he'd reach the East Indies.
That geographical error had such massive consequences, and Spain and Portugal almost came to blows over these new lands.
They did. The Pope stepped in, leading to the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. It basically drew a line down the Atlantic. Spain got the rights to most of the Americas, Portugal got Brazil, plus its routes around Africa and Asia.
Which had long-term effects, like Spain not controlling the African slave trade directly.
Exactly. That had huge implications later on.
So after Columbus, Spain sent out more explorers. Who were some of the key ones?
You had Balboa, who crossed Panama and saw the Pacific in 1513. Magellan's crew, though not Magellan himself, completed the first circumnavigation from 1519 to 1522.
Ponce de Leon in Florida.
Right, looking for the Fountain of Youth in 1513, didn't find it, died after a fight with Native Americans. Coronado explored all through the American Southwest in the 1540s, searching for those mythical cities of gold.
And Cabrillo up the California coast.
Yes, in 1542, claiming that area for Spain. But it's interesting, up to around 1519, Spain hadn't actually gotten huge economic returns from the Americas yet.
That changed pretty quickly with the conquistadores. De Soto, Cortés, Pizarro. Their impact was immense and often brutal.
Immense and brutal, yes. De Soto's expedition through the southeast from 1539 was incredibly violent. Cortés, between 1519 and 1521, brilliant, maybe cynically, exploited Aztec politics and beliefs like the possible return of the god Quetzalcoatl to conquer their empire.
And Pizarro did something similar with the Incas.
He did, defeating the Inca Empire in 1532, seizing unbelievable amounts of gold and silver. Then came the enslavement of vast numbers of indigenous people, especially forced labor in the silver mines like Potosi. It was horrific.
And the long-term impact of these conquests.
Transformative. You get the emergence of mestizo culture through intermarriage. Spain's empire becomes enormous, stretching from California down to Chile. They established settlements like St. Augustine in Florida, the oldest continuous European settlement in the U.S.
And Santa Fe. The missions.
Right, Santa Fe founded as the capital of New Mexico. The mission system spreads, especially in California, under figures like Father Junipero Serra, aimed at converting and controlling native populations. Spain implants its language, its religion, its laws.
But this also led to the Black Legend.
Yes, the narrative, particularly among Spain's European rivals like England and the Netherlands, that Spanish colonization was uniquely cruel and exploitative compared to their own efforts. It was partly propaganda, but it reflected the undeniable brutality of the conquest period.
Okay, so that's Spain conquest, resource extraction, spreading Catholicism. How did the French approach differ? They seemed more focused on trade.
That's a really key distinction. French explorers like Verrazano, Cartier exploring the St. Lawrence River, their initial focus was different. Samuel de Champlain founds Quebec in 1608, the heart of New France.
And their relationship with Native Americans.
Arguably, the French were the most successful among the major powers at building trade relationships. Less focused on displacing people, like the English often were, or on forced labor and conversion, like the Spanish initially were. The French needed native partners for the fur trade.
And gift-giving was crucial to that.
Absolutely crucial. The French learned, maybe better than others, that gift-giving wasn't just a transaction in native diplomacy. It established and maintained relationships, alliances. For native groups, trade was the relationship, and stopping it was like declaring war.
The beaver trade really drove French expansion inward, didn't it? Leading to figures like the coureurs de bois.
It did. Beaver pelts were hugely valuable in Europe. So you get the coureurs de bois, these runners of the woods, independent traders going deep inland, and the voyageurs, the boatmen hauling furs and goods along the rivers and lakes.
And Jesuit missionaries often went with them.
Yes, trying to convert people. They faced hardships, martyrdom sometimes, but as we mentioned, their resilience under duress sometimes earned them a kind of respect from certain native groups. They were also important explorers and map makers.
And the French pushed further south and west, too.
Yeah, Cadillac founded Detroit in 1701, partly to block the English. La Salle traveled all the way down the Mississippi to the Gulf in 1682, claiming that vast territory as Louisiana for King Louis XIV. They set up key posts like New Orleans in 1718 and forts in the Illinois country for farming and trade.
But even with this trade focus, French contact still had devastating effects.
Oh, absolutely. Disease hit native populations just as hard, regardless of whether contact was Spanish, French, or English. Firearms fueled deadlier warfare. Alcoholism became a serious problem in many communities. Indigenous people often saw the danger in any prolonged contact with Europeans.
And the wars intensified.
Yes, especially in the late 17th century. The Iroquois, armed by the English and Dutch, fought fiercely with French allies like the Huron and Algonquin, leading to massive disruption and depopulation, particularly in places like the Ohio Valley. Eventually, the French armed their allies more effectively, pushing the Iroquois towards neutrality, but the damage was immense. Later on, you see native movements trying to revitalize their cultures, push back against European influence, reject alcohol, promote unity.
Okay, finally, let's turn to England. They entered the colonization game a bit later. What got them started?
Several things came together for England. Peace with Spain, finally formalized in 1604, was huge. It freed them up. England's population was growing rapidly, creating pressures on employment, land scarcity, but also a pool of potential colonists looking for opportunity.
Economic drivers again.
Big time. The desire for new markets, resources, religious freedom for some groups, a chance to improve one's social standing. And critically, the rise of joint stock companies provided the money investors pooling resources to fund these risky overseas ventures.
And competition with Spain and later France was always there.
Always. Religious rivalry with Catholic Spain was a big factor early on. Then it shifted more towards economic and geopolitical competition with both Spain and France.
But England had some early stumbles with colonization.
They did. John Cabot explored for England way back in the 1490s, but nothing came of it then. Frobisher explored in the north. Sir Francis Drake was famous for raiding Spanish ships' piracy, essentially.
And the attempts by Gilbert and Raleigh?
Sir Humphrey Gilbert's attempt failed. Sir Walter Raleigh sponsored the Roanoke colony in the 1580s, the famous lost colony. It just vanished. So, yes, some significant failures early on.
But the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, that was a game changer.
A massive turning point. It didn't destroy Spain overnight, but it crippled their naval dominance, boosted English confidence in sea power hugely, and really opened the door for England to seriously challenge Spain in the Atlantic and eventually plant successful colonies.
And then the peace treaty with Spain in 1604 cemented that opportunity.
Exactly. It removed the immediate threat of Spanish military intervention against English efforts in North America, setting the stage for Jamestown in 1607 and everything that followed in the 17th century.
So looking back at this whole period of contact, it really transformed both sides of the Atlantic, didn't it? But in vastly different ways.
Profoundly different. For Native Americans, the overwhelming result was catastrophe. Genocide, mostly through disease, causing that staggering 90% population drop by 1600 we started with. But also, the introduction of things like horses completely changed. Plains, cultures, hunting, warfare, mobility, firearms, too, changed dynamics.
And for Europeans.
It fueled the rise of global empires. It turbocharged capitalism through new resources, new markets, vast amounts of silver and gold, and it revolutionized the European diet, corn, beans, tomatoes, potatoes especially. Potatoes led to population booms in places like Ireland, which then fueled further emigration. Plus, stimulants like coffee, cocoa, tobacco became huge global commodities.
And each European power left a distinct legacy in North America.
They did. England brought traditions of local democratic government, a certain work ethic, the English language. France left its language, culture, Catholic religion, particularly in Canada and Louisiana, and those important trade relationships. Spain brought schools, hospitals, printing presses early on, the Spanish language in the Southwest, Catholicism, certain crafts.
And we should remember, England's 17th century colonization happened against a backdrop of major turmoil back home.
Absolutely. The whole Stuart era, James I, Charles I, the English Civil War, Cromwell, the Restoration with Charles II, the Glorious Revolution with William and Mary, that constant political churn in England deeply influenced how and why their colonies developed.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we've covered a lot. The diversity of Native American societies before contact, the complex reasons Europeans came, the factors driving English settlement specifically, the devastating impact on Native peoples, the transformation of Europe, and those contrasting Spanish, French, and English approaches.
It's such a complex period. You see how everything connects: ancient migrations, religious beliefs, economic theories, technological changes, political rivalries, all converging in this encounter that reshaped the entire world. Moving beyond simple hero-villain stories is crucial to really grasp it.
Which brings us back one last time to that shocking statistic, 90% population decline. Hopefully exploring the details today, the role of disease, the cultural clashes, the different colonial strategies, gives you, the listener, a richer, more nuanced picture of how that tragedy unfolded.
So the question we leave you with is this. Considering this incredibly complex mix of motives, cultures, and consequences we've talked about, how do we today grapple with the legacy of this era? Its impacts are still felt, visibly and invisibly.
And maybe think about this. With such fundamentally different ways of seeing the world colliding, was massive conflict just inevitable? Or were there paths not taken? Chances for different kinds of encounters that were missed? Lots to think about. We hope you'll keep exploring. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.